Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, August 7th, 2017. One more try with all the new setup. It looks like everything is rolling okay. I wanted to say perfectly, but I think I'd be jinxing myself if we did that. How are you this morning? What's the weather like where you are? Apparently if you're on the East Coast, it's raining where you are. I guess almost anywhere. That's how our morning post came to be pretty much off the mark this morning, although there is an explanation. The president is rage tweeting again, though we did not expect him to be, because he is, of course, on his 17-day golf vacation. And the working theory I've been putting together about morning rage tweets is that is something that he does weekday working mornings when he's stuck in the White House waiting for everybody to get his day started for him. He likes to sit around and watch television and let the White House work around him. And on days when he is golfing for the weekend at the Virginia place based out of the White House, he doesn't tweet in the morning, doesn't tend to do Saturday morning or sometimes Sunday morning rage tweeting, even though the news shows are on. He could be doing it. But my working theory is that he doesn't really rage tweet much in the morning. He doesn't tweet when he's playing golf. He manages to stick to that one piece of golfing etiquette and won't tweet, I don't think, while he's on the golf course. But while he's waiting for his ride to the Virginia course, because it takes him about 30 to 40 minutes to get from the White House to the course in Virginia, even with a chauffeured limousine in a police escorted what do they call it? Caravan, I guess you might call it, with the Secret Service vehicles and the limo and police cars, etc. I haven't seen it come through, even though it's pretty close to where I live, but I'm not usually out and about by the time he's rolling over to the golf course. Anyway, I figured that in Bedminster, where he is spending his current vacation, although I understand he's about to move around a little bit, he just kind of has to roll out of bed, and then he's at the golf course already, so he doesn't have to wait for anyone to carry his body to the golf course for him to begin loafing there. So I don't think that there's as much downtime for him to tweet in between rolling out of bed and playing golf. And I don't think he turns to the television for distraction the same way that he does when he's in the White House and boring stuff is happening before he gets to go and play golf. So what does it mean that he's rage tweeting this morning? Well, I found out what the answer is. Within seconds, really, of trying to explain what was probably going on. It's just simply not his tea time yet, or maybe he took an afternoon tea time today. I got the weather report. I got the weather report via Twitter. 5, 6, 7 people tweeting me, no, it's raining in Bedminster and expected to rain all day. He's bored and he has nothing to do. So he's turned on the television and he begins to rage tweet. Of course, he's working hard, having meetings, etc., but pretty quickly we found out that he was angry about Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and that was because Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut was on television at the time criticizing him. And of course, epic rage tweet ensues. Oh, he's terrible, something, he lied about Vietnam. Of course, Donald Trump lied about Vietnam as well, but that's neither here nor there. Why would you hold him to any logical standards? He goes on to say he's such a liar, he's the biggest fraud ever. Carla Bruni probably disagrees about that, but there's no getting through that skull. I mean, there's the thick layer of whatever that, pea-colored floss is that covers his skull that stands in the way. I mean, it could be Kevlar. Maybe that's a good idea. It's not hair, I can tell you that. So there's no way to get into his head. The only thing we can do is figure out or speculate about what's going on inside of it, and the answer is, I want to play golf, and it's raining. And I don't know what kind of billionaire president this is, but in my worldview, if you are the billionaire president, maybe he's neither, I don't know. If it's raining where you are and you want to play golf, fly where it's not raining. I don't understand why a billionaire wouldn't do that. I don't understand why the president can't order that, but maybe it's raining everywhere east of the Mississippi. And I don't think he can fly. I think, I did have it pointed out to me, his superpowers disappear if he flies west of the Mississippi. So I guess that's not happening either. Greg Dworkin, I believe, is here. We'll now find out whether we can hear him. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's right. It worked. Okay. Everything, thumbs up. Thanks, Justice, for all the extra engineering work, and thank you everybody who panicked on my behalf. I think we got it, but I think we need to boost the computing power.
Just remember to put a quarter in the back of the machine every morning, and for 2 hours you're okay.
I like to see if I can get away with slugs, or will it take 2 dimes and a nickel, whatever.
So today is the day that John Kelly finally became chief of staff, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, that's right. There was and that was in the Morning Post too. Lots of speculation over the weekend. They kept him busy. Oh, John Kelly. It's John Kelly's influence. He's got something to do. He's got golf to look forward to. He's not bored.
Right.
Newsweek nailed it with their cover. He's lazy and bored.
Well, there's been a number of covers over the years that really have captured him pretty well. But I have to say, one of the nice things is in his tweet storm this morning, yes. And I stopped looking about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, we have things to do.
But after that Blumenthal series of tweets, Richard Blumenthal, interesting to watch Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut talking about hoax Russian collusion when he was a phony Vietnam con artist.
Oh, no, he was.
Right, among other things. But then talked about collusion, which Armando pointed out is basically admitting that it was there, as he tries to downplay it.
Yeah. The collusion, I meant the collusion that wasn't there. That's the one I meant.
Here's Blumenthal all upset about collusion. Come on. What's the big deal about collusion, really? I mean, the thing is that he just keeps digging it deeper and deeper. Let's look at some of the stuff going on. One of the things that he posted in his tweets was all about how wonderful his base is. The failing New York Times, which has made every wrong prediction about me, including my big election win, apologized. It's not Trump apologizing for being elected. I wish that were so. No, it's the New York Times, he says, apologized to him. Totally inept. The Trump base is far bigger and stronger than ever before, despite some phony fake news polling. Look at rallies in Penn, Iowa, Ohio, and West Virginia. The fact is the fake news Russian collusion story, record stock market, border security, military strength, jobs, Supreme Court pick, economic enthusiasm, deregulation, and so much more have driven the Trump base even closer together. Yeah, they're smaller but closer.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. And interestingly, there have been some polls out. For example, Quinnipiac last week found that 33% of voters overall approve of Trump's job performance. That's actually pretty low.
Well, that's got to be fake.
It's a new low, and notably support among white voters without a college degree, a key Trump demographic, had fallen off as well. This from a Washington Post story discussing exactly that, his tweets and what it all means. Just 43% of that group approved of Trump's job performance, while 50% disapproved. In June, 53% of white voters without a college degree approved, so that's quite a drop. And at the same time, Axios had a story a couple days ago, Trump's dangerously low support among his base. And this comes from Firehouse Strategies, GOP public affairs firm, along with the data analytics team at Optimus. Trump's base shrinking among likely midterm voters in the key swing states of Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. This is based on 2,901 interviews. In April, strongly favorable was 35.3. Now it's 28.6. Somewhat favorable was 9. Now it's 13, up a bit. And strongly unfavorable is up from 36 to 43. So, partner Alex Conan tells Axios, our data shows Trump losing support inside the Republican Party and a noticeable drop in his perceived honesty. Wow. Much of that erosion is among Republicans. Strongly favorable views among GOP voters, as I said, dropped from 54 to 44, while unfavorable views increased from 20.5 to 27.9. Why it matters, Trump can't take continued GOP support for granted in swing states.
All right. Well, I wouldn't if I were him. Oh, I think your mute button never came back on.
How's that?
Okay, better.
Better. So the other news, of course, is I'm almost over my summer cold that I got in Iceland, and I'm doing my best not to cough and disrupt the entire internet.
Did you get a good price on the cold, though?
I did.
It's in euros.
I got it 2/3 off because it was duty free.
They never charge you for those, Virus.
I know. I just, they make you go through the store before you can get out of the airport, but that's
Have
okay.
I got something to declare? Holy cow.
Let me declare. I think that Trump is a complete jerk, okay? Let me declare that. I was looking at this article here from Politico, which is called Trump's Trade Pullout Roils Rural America. And actually there's some startling data in there.
They're roiling the rurals.
Yeah, this article is talking to his Iowa base and some of the rural voters that went for him. I was disappointed Trump kind of broadly wiped out TPP before there was even discussion. Jerry Mayer, a Wright County corn and soybean farmer who supported Trump, says he feels the same way. If you're at the table and nothing happens, that's one thing. But if you're not at the table, that's even more frustrating. The downward trend of commodity prices has been a lingering reality for the third-generation farmer who lives just outside Eagle Grove. The USDA's annual farm income report forecasts that net farm income will drop this year by 8.7% compared with 2016.
Wow.
Incomes have been increasing steadily since 2013 when they hit an all-time high of $120 billion. The forecast for this year's projects net incomes down to little more than $62.3 billion. It's like half of what it was in 2013. That is a big drop. And if you get that article and click down and scroll past the pigs and look at the graphs that they have there, and there's one about halfway down the page, looking at U.S. agriculture's declining fortunes. For the fourth consecutive year, U.S. farmers will see their net income decrease with a forecasted decline of 8.7%. That's nearly a 50% decline since incomes reached a record high in 2013. So you look at that and say, well, this is his rural base. Why would they be happy about what he's doing?
They're not.
Not. And so that's part of the reason why the base is getting soft. And this particular segment, though it may be a small segment, I don't know, of his base is not going to be reassured by rallies and building the wall and going after affirmative action at colleges. I mean, this is not what they voted for. What they wanted is they wanted improved economics for themselves, and they ain't getting it. So that's going to have implications going into 2018 and 2020 as well.
Okay. By the way, what happened in 2013? The launch of FarmersOnly.com. That's the turnaround.
FarmersOnly.com?
You don't watch the right television channels late at night.
Guess not.
Wow. Okay. It's a. I'm gonna have to explain this. FarmersOnly.com is they build themselves as. It's funny. Of course, they call themselves FarmersOnly.com, and then they immediately advertise it there. You don't have to be a farmer, but oh my goodness, they got the earworm jingle. It's a dating service for country folk, for roiled rurals, I guess. Who are angry about, apparently there's a market for people who are angry about being matched up with, what did Stephen Miller call them? Yeah, well, they say city folks, cosmopolitans, as Stephen Miller would say, but that, they just don't understand.
Stephen Miller, I want to talk about that a little bit.
Oh,
I want to start with this
either.
Article from the New York Times.
Okay. I just think that they should have left them alone and they would be still farming well. And
yeah, I'm trying to leave them out of it.
It's not their fault. I mean, it's human instinct and everything. But okay, everything was working fine until they showed them how to get dates.
Yeah, I guess so. Ever since then. So this article in the New York Times: many politicians lie, but Trump has elevated the art of fabrication, and talks about just how blatantly he lies, fake news, and all this stuff.
Oh, yes.
Kind of interesting article. The glaring difference between Mr. Trump and his predecessors is the sheer magnitude of falsehoods and exaggerations. PolitiFact rates just 20% of the statements it reviewed as true, and a total of 69% either mostly false, or pants on fire. That leaves scholars like Ms. Goodwin to wonder whether Mr. Trump, in elevating the art of political fabrication, has forever changed what Americans are willing to tolerate from their leaders. What's different today and what's scarier today is these lies are pointed out and there's evidence they're wrong, and yet because of the attacks on the media, there are a percentage of people in the country who are willing to say maybe he's telling the truth. That's not really it. People understand totally that he's lying. They just want him to go ahead anyway because he's winning in their mind.
Okay.
In other words, if you're a racist, if you're a white supremacist, and you see Trump's moves on immigration and affirmative action and building the wall, you don't care whether he's lying or not. What you care about is he delivering for you? And so I think the focus on whether he's lying or not is interesting and true, but somewhat misplaced in terms of trying to analyze it. Brendan Nyhan did some great work on this. People totally understand that Trump is a liar. People totally understand that he's BSing.
I don't see how you could miss it.
But that's not the point to them. They want something else,
sense.
whatever that something else might be. In the case of the racist, it's the racism stuff. In the case of the rural folks, they want to stick it to the city folks. In terms of if your farm income is dropping, you want somebody who's going to help fix it. Now, you may have voted wrongly, but you know it's not that you didn't understand he was lying. You did. It's just that you wanted something else entirely on top of that. So it's still worthwhile to point out all the lies. It's just that you shouldn't expect that in and of itself, by itself, is going to change anything.
Okay, that's a more comforting explanation. Certainly,
George Washington, he's
sort
not.
of. Right. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say it's all that comforting. I mean, it's terrible that we ignore the lying, but it's better than believing that so many people just don't think they're lies or just don't see it. I think I'd rather know that they see it and just made an irrational decision about what to do about it.
Right. And again, it's not to compare them, but looking at it the other way, going back to when Bill Clinton was impeached but not convicted, there's plenty of people who looked at him and said, I really don't like what he's doing, but I'm voting for him anyway or I'm supporting him anyway. His support was fairly high after the impeachment thing, because I'm pretty happy with how he's running the country, even though personally he's a jerk.
That did happen. We measured that.
And it did
closely.
happen, and so people can make that distinction. It's not difficult to do. And I think that that's what's happening here. So whenever somebody says to me, oh, well, it really doesn't matter that he's like, well, it doesn't. The fact that people understand that he's lying is important, and then trying to understand why they don't care about it anyway is a different topic altogether. That doesn't diminish the media that points out the lies, and that's why I'm going after that in particular. So, for example, the media does point out, a very nice piece in Political Magazine, of course, by one of my all-time favorites, Jeff Greenfield, the ugly history of Stephen Miller's cosmopolitan epithet. Surprise, surprise, the insult has its roots in Soviet anti-Semitism.
And it looks, you're right. What's Stephen Miller's background? I mean, he's got I'm looking at the kind of sleepy eyes thing, which usually drives Trump crazy. But yeah, is he Russian by background? I wonder. He's got Putin eyes. Okay.
What's a cosmopolitan? It's a cousin to elitist, but with a more sinister undertone. It's a way of branding people or movements that are unmoored to the traditions and beliefs of a nation and identify more with like-minded people regardless of their nationality. In this sense, the revolutionary pamphleteer Thomas Paine might have been an early American cosmopolitan when he declared, "The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion."
Okay, that is pretty Cosmo.
Yeah, sounds like he was a social justice warrior, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the eyes of their foes, cosmopolitans tend to cluster in the universities, the arts, the dark arts, and in urban centers where familiarity with diversity makes for high comfort level with untraditional ideas and lives. For a nationalist, these are fighting words. Your country is your country. Your fellow citizens are your brethren, and your country's traditions, religious or otherwise, should be yours. A nation whose people, especially influential people, develop other ties, undermine national strength, and must be repudiated. One reason why cosmopolitan is an unnerving term is that it was the key to an attempt by Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin to purge the culture of dissident voices. In a 1946 speech, he deplored works in which the positive Soviet hero is derided and inferior before all things foreign, and cosmopolitanism that we all fought against from the time of Lenin, characteristic of the political leftovers, is many times applauded. And then he talked about bourgeois Western influences, and many of the cosmopolitans were Jewish, and official Soviet propaganda for a time devoted significant energy into unmasking the Jewish identities of writers who published under pseudonyms. Okay. And what makes this history relevant is that all across Europe, nationalist political figures are still making the same kinds of arguments, usually but not always stripped of blatant anti-Semitism, to constrict the flow of ideas to the boundaries of free political expression. Putin, for example, does it, and there's plenty of authoritarianism brewing in places like Hungary and Poland, so that's certainly something to keep an eye on. And yeah, it does have a long history, and it's all part of the idea that Trump has opened up the political stage with permission structure to do, on the one hand, one form of lying, which is propaganda. On the other hand, of course, unleashing the dark forces that have to do with white supremacism and anti-Semitism, which we all saw during the run-up to the election with the whole Pepe meme.
What a bizarre set of circumstances.
Right, but, should not be forgotten that when Miller throws out cosmopolitan or something like that and talks to a CNN reporter about stuff like that, it has meaning way beyond what you just heard on TV.
Yeah. And lots of unmasking of that past, and lots of pushback, of course, from the people who supported the leveling the charges. But not surprising, and I think they got the roots right. And by the way, his mother's family is the Glotzer family from Belarus, so I guess he's got their eyes.
So here's another piece.
Yes.
Talk about lies, big lies, and the big lie. And this one, a great piece by Van Newkirk in Atlantic, The Myth of Reverse Racism. The idea of white victimhood is increasingly central to the debate over affirmative action.
Which is renewed now, thanks to
unfortunately. Okay. Contrary to initial indications, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice won't be dismantling affirmative action after all, at least that's the current word from Trump administration officials, after a New York Times article claimed the department would be using the broad powers of justice to take on universities that it decided had discriminated against white people.
Poor white people.
The DOJ since clarified that it's gearing up to investigate complaints from dozens of organizations alleging that certain universities use quotas, which are illegal, to limit the number of Asian American enrollees. And then talks about the fact that using Asian Americans as a shield against white resentment is kind of a ridiculous but expected kind of ploy. The deployment of Asian Americans as an exemplary group in race relations is nothing new. The model minority myth of Asian Americans has been used since the 60s to denigrate other non-whites.
Yeah.
And that's from a 1995 Boston College Third World Law Journal article. So it's not something that's all of a sudden they invented. And Van has it's a long read, but a nice summary of a lot of the stuff that's going on, quoting sources who go back 10, 15 years to point out that a lot of this isn't new. So that's another part of the
very
law
nice. Yes.
That they've brought up.
And I like the acknowledgement of the I guess you could hardly avoid it in the subject of the article, but important subtopic, the whole Asian model minority thing, deep. And lots of writing on it, and just hasn't gotten the attention lately that it's deserved. But we see brief flashes of it every once in a while. It'd be a good thing if we can at least bring that to mind again, the best thing that can come out of this.
Right. Again, speaking of lying, this is an August 4th piece I didn't want to just have slip into the ether, by Philip Bump in the Washington Post, why the NRA is going after the media.
Okay.
Basically, sales are down.
Oh. All right. Well, I can believe that.
Clinton lost, ostensibly good news for the NRA, since it meant that even the minor threat to new gun controls was gone, but it also meant there was no one to push back against, or did it. At the Conservative Political Action Conference in February, NRA head Wayne LaPierre gave a remarkable speech during which they offered up a vast, loosely aggregated opposition that was the new threat for gun owners, leftists, anarchists, criminals, and, of course, national media machine. For the first time, we also face an enemy utterly dedicated to destroy not just our country, but also Western civilization. Not of foreign invasion, but of liberals and the media. And then they've created a bunch of videos reinforcing the identity of the NRA's new enemy. The most infamous is from Dana Loesch, called Violence of Lies.
Okay. All right. I do want to remind you, by the way, we're going to have to take one of our new breaks in just a minute or two. We're about 2 minutes out from the break, but
okay, you'll have to tell me how that goes.
I don't know. We'll have to see. But we can certainly continue to discuss this article, and then we'll wrap up.
Here's the professional way to do it is to say, I hate to interrupt you, but we have to take a break now for our listeners here to acknowledge their home stations, including We Act Radio, and in Colorado, it's...
Yeah, right. We don't know. But save that, because we're not there yet. But I'm warning you that it's coming up.
I'm just practicing.
Okay, good. We should do that again.
Do we do it? Do we hire somebody to do it? How does that work?
Well, I'll talk our way out of it, and then we'll see what runs in between. They have their own thing in Rochester, what they're going to run. We have our own thing here, what we're going to do. You and I get to just chat through the break and then decide what to do with the chatter, which won't go out over the air. Okay. But we got about a minute till we go out to that, so we'll get back to it. But
fantastic. Well, you know what? I might just wrap up in that minute, and that gives you a chance to do it really clearly and smoothly.
That may.
Right? Because after all, the other things that I just wanted to point out, I do have an abbreviated pundit roundup up for this morning because it's Monday. It's one of the days that I post. It's called How to Win and How Not to in 2018. Nice link to a piece by Ari Berman, which is a broadcast piece. Registration, getting people to the polls, not winning back Trump voters is the key for Democrats, says Ari Berman. And Washington Post points out that although Democrats are out of power in the states, the governor races here have a good opportunity to pull back some of that stuff. Charlie Pierce is talking about Democrat self-sabotage and the way they're going after Kamala Harris and Cory Booker.
Okay. Well, we've hit our mark here, and I think we'll go out and certainly, I think now we're in our 3-minute break, which, by the way, you're entirely entitled to wade through and wrap up either on the other side with anything else you wanted to add. I don't want these breaks to become the point where you necessarily take off for the day if you've got more to do. But yeah, well, it's awkward. We're learning our way through it at the moment. So what's happening right now is what goes out over the live stream is a break that Justice has engineered. That's a music and PSA break.
But your podcast listeners are hearing us
podcast listeners hearing us talk, which is interesting. We can decide maybe like what to do.
So I can't talk smack about Armando and think he won't find out.
Well, it depends on what I see. Now, if I just send this recording to Scott and say this is the podcast listeners then get a bonus 9 minutes of the show. Which doesn't go out by broadcast radio, during which I suppose you can say all the things that you wanted to say about Donald Trump, and it doesn't go out over broadcast, but everybody hears it for podcast. Or we can opt later on to just chop out the 3 minutes from the podcast as well, so that the live broadcast matches the podcast. We have to decide what we want to do with that.
Just between you and me, David, here's what I really think.
Yeah, and I think I'm leaning towards keeping that in, especially if someone is also on the air with me. If not, then I can, of course, take a break and run and get a breakfast, snack, drink of water, or whatever.
Pop-Tarts.
Pop-Tarts always available to me. So, by the way, for updating, depending, I guess, if we keep this in the podcast or not, we're about 1:15 from coming back. But, so we'll have to decide. It's going to be interesting and awkward, but I hope that it satisfies the folks in Rochester. They've been dying for the chance to identify their station without playing it over our talk, which is awkward for them.
Right, but that was a good suggestion. And, now that I know how it works, we can certainly, work around that.
Okay. We're 1 minute till we're back, or about, I make it about 40 seconds, 45 at this point.
Okay.
But if you want to hang on and sum up or add anything else, or do another segment?
I'll hang out and just sum up a little bit.
Okay. We'll get used to it. But I think it sounds professional on the other end. That's the good news.
Well, that's good news. Well, again, there's quite a number of pieces here that we don't have sent to you in terms of individual links, but are on the pundit roundup that I think are worth going over. So as soon as we're back from the break, we'll mention some of those and then wrap up and then off to work.
Okay. Well, I've got about 5 seconds. I think
I'd be going golfing, but it's raining.
Okay, I have a 10-second mark here from Justice telling us we're almost back on. So the next question is whether there's any lag whatsoever in Skype, and we're back on because my clock says 9:31 and 12 seconds. Or do I wait for his signal? And we're on, so we'll do it if we go by his signal. And I think that's working fine. Then we're back. Thank you for everyone who waited through the break with us. Those of you listening on the Netroots Radio live stream will have experienced our first station break, which I think we took successfully. Probably sounded fantastic and made you think you were listening to some kind of professional radio broadcast.
We're not
We're
fooling
back.
anybody.
Yeah. And maybe we'll engineer something up that plays us out. I probably won't hear it. Maybe a little jingle. Tom can whip up something fun in all the spare time he has and say, we're back with Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. Greg Dworkin joining me, your host, David Waldman, KagroX on Twitter if you'd like to reach us. By the way, easy way to do it, use the KITM hashtag to make sure that your messages hang up there on screen for a good long time and we can get to them all. Greg, thanks for waiting through the break.
Oh, sure.
Let's find out what you have to sum up with and if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Well, we were
if you want to do it for like an
about
hour, that's
the
okay.
pundit roundup and some of the stories about elections for 2018 and 2020. Charlie Pierce was talking about going after Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and Deval Patrick and other luminaries who might be running in 2020. We don't even know that they are. Elizabeth Warren said again she's not running. But I think the more important stories are the ones, for example, we covered the myth of reverse racism by Van Newkirk and a parallel one by Carol Anderson in the New York Times, the politics of white resentment. I think these are, important to understand because it's a lot what drives the Trump base. And one of the more interesting things that I've been doing, of course, as a favor to you, so you don't have to, is looking at conservative media, not Breitbart, but conservative media, and seeing what's there. Here's a piece from NRO, National Review. Is Mueller's grand jury impeachment step one? It's a long way from here to there, but don't be surprised that that's where we're headed, says National Review. They were never Trumpers, by the way. Stephen Hayes in Weekly Standard, playing defense, talks about a lot of the bad things Trump has done. These sorts of fiascos and misadventures began the moment this presidency began with the new president's bizarre insistence that his inaugural crowds were larger than Obama's. Despite majorities in both houses of Congress, his policy agenda is at a standstill. Remember, this is conservative media. Hundreds of high-level positions throughout the administration remain unfilled. Members of Congress report to us that the president can't hold a conversation at even a rudimentary level about issues supposedly high on the president's agenda, tax reform, for instance, and health care. He can talk about golf, though. He lies about matters both large and small, including about his golf score, and is obsessed with perceived slights in the news media. So, conservative media is about hatted with him. In fact, here's a piece from Huffington Post. Caitlyn Jenner reportedly now detests Donald Trump, apologizes for wearing a MAGA hat, and Charlie Pierce points out, nobody cares.
Yeah. Whatever. I can't.
Again, it's not. People don't read conservative media. Don't assume that everybody there is just all Trump all the time. It's just the opposite. It's more Jeff Flake stuff.
Okay. Yes. Still evaluating that. I don't know I don't know what to tell you about.
You don't have to love it. You don't have to vote for him, but just be aware. Find allies where you can. And then the final piece here is from Will Bunch from Philly.com. How can Kelly save Trump when he's a human rights disaster at Homeland Security? This is something people shouldn't forget about. The whole idea of putting all the generals in charge so you don't have to worry about Trump is probably the second worst idea people can possibly have. The worst idea is not doing that and letting Trump be in charge. But, it's still something to keep in mind that it's hardly a panacea. So with that, that's my summary for today. Welcome to Monday, folks. And welcome to the new occasional station breaks. Are you going to do this every half hour? How's that going?
Yeah, as it turns out, we'll do it at the top and bottom of the hour, and we'll get better at it.
Even that, knowing that, that's more than I knew before. So
right. I knew it was coming, but I didn't know what to do with it. We didn't really practice anything. But I'm told we do have a jingle, so that's cool.
Wait a minute, that's not true. We rehearsed this entire broadcast for like a week and a half before we did today.
Okay, and then you say
we
didn't rehearse, and then I say we did.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. All right. Well, that worked out on cue.
It's not there yet, though. So with that, as David pointed out, this is Greg Dworkin speaking to my friend David Waldman, Kagro in the morning. I could say that even without a station break.
You do.
And I'll be back Wednesday, and we'll do it again.
All right, we're on break, everyone, until Wednesday.
Okay,
so,
keep that in mind.
There you go. This is the end of the show. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate your patience with trying out our new experiment.
This was fun.
Yeah, well, it gives you a chance to catch up and organize the wind-up. I think that we'll just learn to use it that way.
Also, let Abby in and out, so I'll have to remember
Yes,
that.
oh, right. Also, that's another thing. We should see if we can train her to wait for the half hour.
Right, exactly. Take care.
All right, thanks. You do the same. We'll see you on Wednesday. We'll go through the same drill. Of course, we'll go through the same drill on Tuesday. It's a lot easier, of course, if it's just me. I can. One of the things about not being in the same studio, obviously, you can't hold up. Well, we have no producer per se, although Justice filling in gamely for our first try at getting this done and signaling when the break is. But the goal is that eventually Justice will not have to sit there and do that. And I have some alarms set, in various places to go off, hopefully without your having to hear them, to remind me when there's a minute before the break. Although, we have to figure out how much lag time there is on the stream and how much lag time, if any, there is in Skype, and try and synchronize these things. So we'll listen to it. Oh, you know what we'll have to do? I'll have a conference with you at some point after the show, Justice, and you can tell us what it sounded like coming in and coming out, and whether we need to learn to adjust so that on my clock at 9:31 and 7 seconds is when we actually come out, or something like that. And I can just keep an eye on that. And eventually we'll make it sound super professional, like we've always been doing it. And it's not a brand new thing at all. But maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's something we don't want to do. We'll always keep it rough-edged here on the Kagro in the Morning Show to just show you how real it really is. Broadcasting from a kitchen in Virginia, I mean, it doesn't get any realer than that. Anyway, let's see. So let's go over some of the other news that we have saved up, and this should not discourage, say, Armando from calling in. Just we'll have to deal with breaks, and it'll give you a good chance to vent for 3 minutes and entertain the podcast folks with some inclusions of behind-the-scene chatter. We'll have to figure out whether we're going to make a regular practice of that or not. What else is in pocket? Let's find out. And also let's talk about the upcoming schedule. We'll be here all week this week, and in place for a Monday show next week, August being August, the Congress being on vacation themselves. The President, of course, working hard, taking phone calls and meeting with bags of chips in Bedminster, New Jersey. I did mention it. I think I read this morning that he's planning to do some moving around, but I think that moving around he mentioned, I think he tweeted this morning that he was on his way to New York at some point. I can take a look, and I think Greg sent copies of all his morning tweets, so maybe we can enlarge that and see which one, if any of them were talking about the trip to New York. And I don't know whether he gives any detail on it or not. Oh, see. The new Skype tells me in order to see the thing, I have to download it, and all this nonsense, and that means I have to open up another app to see it, and I don't know. So Skype doesn't do that for me anymore. Anyway, it's not very important. He does say, though, he's going to, this is working hard from New Jersey while White House goes through long-planned renovation, going to New York next week for more meetings. So I guess my initial question is, does he mean going to Trump Tower? He hasn't been back to Trump Tower since he was inaugurated. Or is he going to his Westminster, Westchester, not Westminster, but Westchester, New York golf facility, his golf course there? Does he keep a bungalow there like he does at Bedminster? I'm not really sure. Maybe that's where I got Westminster, Bedminster, and Westchester fused together. So I don't know. I'm just kind of curious whether he's just headed to another golf property or not. Although that does bring to mind the possibility that he's once again trying to spend enough time at his properties to be able to continue to claim the real estate professionals' tax deductions in all of this mess. It'd be curious. We'd all be curious to see the tax returns, of course, but that ain't happening. So we'll never find out for sure. until we pry them loose in some sort of prosecutorial setting, I'm sure. Anyway, he just it seems like he could be just traveling from one golf venue to another in all of this hard work. And I'm sure in his mind, I'm sure he's one of those guys that he chooses his playing partners somewhat strategically, people that he wants to meet with, and he considers golfing with them to be a meeting. And it is, after a fashion. It's just that he's incapable of accomplishing anything concrete during a regular meeting, golf or otherwise. So, all he's doing is blathering about, like I am, about what he intends to achieve. Who knows whether that's really going to happen or not. All right. Well, at any rate, trying to catch up with what's going on and talking about our schedule. We'll take our own break as I take the family on the road next week, beginning Tuesday, and spilling over into the beginning of the following week. And so I'm trying to prepare some broadcasts for that. And, of course, the new station breaks also add a new twist to the engineering. But I'll tell you what I've been up to is diving into Pocket and trying to, as we're always talking about all the fabulous stories that get left behind in Pocket, I thought that might make an interesting week. This would be difficult or impossible to keep up with the actual news from day to day while on the road and record podcasts that touch on the latest headlines from the road with all sorts of unreliability along the way. I thought it might make a good time, and we might as well acknowledge that we're taking a break from the day-to-day news, although I'm sure that they'll sneak in to the podcasts occasionally as we relate the old stories to the new, but it might make a good opportunity to clear out those stories that have been hiding in the wings, in Pocket, some of them for several years, literally for several years. Looks like I started using Pocket in about 2013. So I'm digging up old stories that we missed for whatever reason, some of which are, of course, still relevant. Some of them reveal some very interesting detail we have forgotten along the way, but the topic is related to something that remains hot at the moment. Some of them sort of evergreen stories or just general stories of interest that I thought you might find worth sharing during the vacation break. I'll be interested to see what your reaction is to some of those stories. That's what I'm up to. I've been trying to record those in fits and starts and then engineer breaks into them is going to be quite a challenge. But I think we can make it work. Thanks so much again to Justice and everybody else who helped out at Netroots Radio in trying to put this thing together. Hopefully it satisfies the good folks at Radio Free Rochester, or Rochester Free Radio, or I now have introduced doubt in my own mind by not simply sticking to one or another of the taglines there. But thanks for the suggestion, and I hope it works out for you. Hope it helps us organize the show a little bit better as well. What do we have in Pocket right now that is of particular interest? There's a couple of things. Let's see. What will we grab? I saw this one tweeted around this morning, and I'll bet it's not yet burning up the wires anywhere except in South Carolina, where the story is set. But it looks like something that has some national importance, maybe just as a warning sign, let's say. Certainly should be easy to connect the dots for you. So it was being tweeted around along with the note that this was mind-blowing, and also the note from our friend Grudging Tweeter, who said, gee whiz, corruption in South Carolina. Can you guess what party might be involved with this one? Let me bring this up here from the South Carolina's paper, the Post and Courier. Emails. You can't go wrong with headlining your political story. Emails. These emails reveal that the South Carolina Attorney General coordinated with a key figure in the State House probe on letter booting special prosecutor off case. And I'm not intimately familiar with the underlying story here, so we'll just dive right in. Glenn Smith is the writer for the Post and Courier for this August 5th piece. Let's find out what's going on here and gasp at the parallels. South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson enlisted the help of a central figure in the State House corruption probe in an attempt to sideline the case's special prosecutor, just as the investigation was about to zero in on Wilson's close allies, according to emails obtained by the Post and Courier. Sort of amazing that this could be going on at the same time that we have something happening like this on the federal level, and I guess this is offered up as a cautionary tale. If you're the kind of person who can't believe that this could possibly be happening anywhere in America, I guess this is a great reminder that it's not that hard to imagine. It's in a highly unusual move, the story continues, that legal observers say raises serious questions about the allegiances of the state's chief law enforcement official and his willingness to meddle in matters in which he had already revealed a potential conflict. Wilson, however, painted the emails as an innocent exchange with a trusted advisor with better grammar skills. Okay. The emails, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, which means it'll be a little bit old, but okay, show Wilson used his private account. Private emails stop the presses. It's true. Private account to coordinate with his embattled political consultant Richard Quinn on an October 2014 letter aimed at derailing the investigation being conducted by Wilson's hand-picked special prosecutor, David Pasco. The exchange came as Pasco prepared to dig deeper into a state law enforcement division report detailing alleged misdeeds by sitting lawmakers. Named in that document were Quinn and his son, State Representative Rick Quinn, who was also identified as a potential target of the probe. Just a few weeks earlier, Wilson had told his chief deputy he had a potential conflict and needed to be firewalled on the matter. We know that those don't hold up very often. But that didn't stop the Attorney General, because who cares, right, from seeking advice from the elder Quinn on phrasing a letter to pull Pasco off the case, the email chain shows. Letter 1 is the longer one I read to you tonight. Letter 2 is a slightly shorter version. Wilson wrote to the elder Quinn, "I will be working on these tomorrow with Bob. Let me know what you think." Quinn returned a revised draft to the Attorney General's office the following day, noting that it contained a few new edits. That same day, Pasco was informed that Wilson's office would be handling the investigation from there on. John Freeman, a University of South Carolina law professor and legal ethicist, called the exchange between Wilson and Quinn disturbing and highly irregular, although it's become a little more regular these days, hasn't it? I have never heard of a chief prosecutor deliberately sharing confidential information or plans concerning a criminal investigation with someone who was a target or subject of the investigation, Freeman said. Mr. Wilson has some explaining to do. Reached Friday, Wilson said he did nothing more than reach out to a longtime advisor to South Carolina attorneys general for advice on the letter's tone and to make sure it was grammatically correct. He can't find anybody else to do that. He wanted to ensure he didn't come across as too hostile and that his nouns and pronouns were in the right place. Wilson and Quinn contributed nothing substantive, said Quinn contributed nothing substantive to the letter, and in the end, he chose to call Pasco instead. Okay, I never even sent the letter Richard polished and checked for grammar, he said. Sounds like a likely story. By which, of course, I mean not very likely, but okay. Though Wilson described his subsequent phone conversation with Pasco as pleasant, as all such conversations ultimately are, no? The special prosecutor was effectively sidelined for months after the episode, causing the probe to stall. Pasco and Richard Quinn declined to comment on the episode when contacted Friday. The exchange reveals for the first time that Wilson and his staff sought to wrest control of the investigation from Pasco almost from the moment he turned his attention to the Quinns and others named in the SLED, S-L-E-D, report. It also further shows the cozy relationship Wilson had with Richard Quinn, a political kingmaker whose clients have run the Attorney General's office for more than 2 decades, and his son, who has since been indicted on misconduct charges. The Quinns have been close allies of Wilson throughout his political career. Their support helped him become the nation's youngest Attorney General in 2010 and win re-election 4 years later. All told, Wilson has spent about $500,000 in campaign funds with Richard Quinn and Associates during his election bids. Wilson also has served as the public face of the Conservative Leadership Project, a Quinn-run nonprofit that hosted political forums across the state with the 2016 GOP presidential hopefuls. I say GOP rather than GOP because this is the first time, and here's the point, we were supposed to guess which party was involved. That's the first time there's been anything like a mention of the word Republican in all of this. Conservative Leadership Project and GOP. The very next sentence actually says the word Republicans. But how far into this article are we? Political observers suspected the Republican Attorney General and Quinn were using the events to boost Wilson's prospects for a possible run for governor in 2018, prospects that dimmed as the probe dragged on and further entangled the Quinns. So just a brief moment, a brief aside for media criticism on that one. That is, what is this? How far into this thing are we? We've been reading for a little while here. Let's see. 1 paragraph, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Some of these are short paragraphs. It's a little cheap, but 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Still not there. 19. It's the 19th paragraph is the first mention, really the first hint of which party we're actually talking about here. Now, you could have guessed, obviously, somebody who's going to be in statewide office in South Carolina, very likely at this stage of the game to be a Republican. Maybe you recognized the brand of corruption and guessed that he was a Republican, but you're just showing your bias, you know. And of course, everybody likely reading the story, at least in the Post and Courier, other than online, I guess, like me, or passing it around for its national interest. It's a localized story, and they know very well who these people are, generally speaking. But then again, how many times do we read something in the New York Times that links, for instance, to who exactly is Hillary Clinton? And does everybody know that she actually was the Democratic nominee during the 2016 election cycle, but that she won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College vote? And so therefore, because they take time out to remind us in that paper, although I guess the New York Times is, of course, more conscious of a broader audience, perhaps, than the Post and Courier might anticipate in columns like this one. But I don't know. I just find it interesting that got, buried for so long. Wilson has also served as the public face of the Conservative Leadership Project. That's where we left off. That's the Quinn-run nonprofit that hosted forums with the 2016 presidential hopefuls on the Republican side. Political observers, suspected the Republican Attorney General and Quinn were using the events to boost Wilson's prospects for a possible run for governor in 2018. Prospects that dimmed as the probe dragged on and further entangled the Quinns. State agents raided the Columbia offices of Richard Quinn and Associates in March, hauling off a trove of records, including tens of thousands of emails. 2 months later, Rick Quinn became the 4th lawmaker charged in the investigation, accused of improperly lobbying while in public office and failing to report more than $4.5 million paid to political consulting and mailing companies operated by him and his father. I mean, at least disclose the money, please. Wilson said he still uses the Quinn firm's bookkeeping services for his campaign activities, but has curtailed his communications with Richard Quinn and his son in recent months out of respect for his office, the investigation, and their legal situation. They are still my friends, but at the same time I also understand that appearances matter, he said. Really? Now, you do. You understand that? Okay. Emails, however, show Wilson and his staff continued to correspond and trade information with the Quinns well after their names first surfaced in the SLED report in December of 2013. Though that portion of the report was sealed from the public, Wilson and others in his office were privy to allegations that Rick Quinn, a Lexington Republican, had used his position as majority leader. Oh, that's a nice note to add too, by the way. Thanks. In 21st paragraph, to send political mailer business from the House caucus to his personal company, making a profit on the arrangement. The elder Quinn was also mentioned in the document. That seems important too. Still, Wilson and his staff continued to trade emails with Rick Quinn about pending ethics reforms and possible penalties for lawmakers' misconduct during 2014 as the corruption probe took aim at then House Speaker Bobby Harrell, a Charleston Republican who would later plead guilty to misusing campaign cash. In May of that year, Wilson also shared with Richard Quinn a copy of a letter he was sending to then House Ethics Committee Chairman Kenny Bingham to gauge his interest in launching a parallel ethics inquiry into Harrell. At the same time, the state grand jury was probing criminal allegations against the former speaker. Wilson said Friday the email had been sent to Quinn in error. In March of 2015, Wilson also fielded an email from Rick Quinn seeking legal opinions on the validity of Freedom of Information Act requests that had been filed by media outlets seeking information on the House caucus spending, information directly related to the allegations that had been raised by him in the SLED report. Wilson replied that he was out of town, but looped in his aides to respond to Quinn. Wilson said Friday that he considered Rick Quinn a friend, not a target of the probe at the time. Rick Quinn did not return phone calls from the Post and Courier seeking comment. Wilson also confirmed Friday that 3 former members of his staff, including his then Deputy Chief of Staff, Adam Piper, were receiving paychecks from Richard Quinn and Associates during this period, while also drawing state salaries. Before going to work for Wilson, Piper was a political consultant for the Quinn firm. This is, what a tangled web we weave. And I hadn't even really figured out whether or not they were going to do all the deceiving and deception. But I guess they figured that was on the near horizon. Anyway, again, time for us to prepare for another of our special station ID breaks. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on the other side. We're back with the show. Thanks for waiting through the second of our experimental station breaks. This time I spent the time in the background trying to figure out how to use the quiet mode that my wife discovered on the telephone that you sometimes hear ringing in the background. We've had the phone for probably like 10 years, and I've never been able to figure out exactly how to silence the thing so that it just doesn't ring or answer aloud during the show. And we found out that it has a quiet mode that's supposed to be very easy to use. And she used it over the weekend experimentally, except I should have said, rather than you using it experimentally over the weekend, why don't I use it experimentally over the weekend so that I know how to set the thing? It's a nice little button here, and you press it and hold it, and it says, how long would you like to set quiet mode for? And you have the choice of up to 1 to 12 hours to use quiet mode. So I said I would like to have it for 2 hours. And then it just sits there on the 2 and says, blinks at me as though there were something else that I was supposed to be saying or telling it in order to get it to start on quiet mode. It just never told me what that other thing was. So now, during the next break, I'll have to call my wife and say, when you press the quiet mode thing and it asks for how many hours and you tell it how many hours, how do you get it to acknowledge that you've told it how many hours you want it on quiet for? By which point, of course, I will not need it on quiet mode anymore. So that was another huge technology fail. I just thought I'd fill you in on that one. Thumbs up from Justice on our re-entry into things. So I think that basically you got to take the cues in real time. I think, Justice, what's happening here. The cues in real time from through Skype messaging, I guess, has got us matched up perfectly, which probably means that I went out on the break a little bit early, but came back right on time. And what we need to do now is I need to watch how many seconds it takes to get around to your cue versus what's on my clock. And then once we get that number nailed down, you won't have to sit there and give me the cues. I just wait for that many seconds to roll by and begin speaking again. Is that going to work for everybody? You can tell me, and again, use the KITM hashtag on Twitter to let us know about what you're hearing and what it's like to be on the other end of the break. Let's see. Monica here says the break, as heard live through TuneIn, sounded pretty professional. Will it be every hour? It will be every half hour. How exciting is that? It seems like a little bit much, but apparently I think it's required by the FCC still, which is an amazing thing all by itself, that they do it at least every hour. And I guess best practices for most radio stations is that they do it every half hour. I'm sure there are some that do it even more frequently than that. I've always been confused by that. That seemed like a good old-fashioned style FCC regulation back in the day when spectrum was limited and whatnot, and you had to tell people what station they were listening to because they could be just happening by a radio station, spinning the dial, if you will, driving along or sitting at home if you had one of those gigantic home units. Pardon me. And you couldn't necessarily be sure exactly what station you were tuned to. Now, in the days of digital tuners and even radios in the cars in particular that will tell you on your screen, not only digitally what number, what frequency you're tuned to, but it'll even identify the station and sometimes even the show that's on or the music that's playing. It seems antiquated, but I think, the regulation remains on the books, so there's nothing you can do about that one. So our friends in Rochester were forced to play their station ID over us, and that's never fun. But they were forced to do it twice an hour at that. So at least this way we'll have these breaks, and I can use it to try to figure out the rest of the technology in my home office, if you will, our studio, our worldwide headquarters. Good news, though, that at least it came out well, thanks to Justice and to Tom for helping engineer that one. We'll see if we can't get even better at it as the time goes on. When we left off, we were reading from the Post and Courier's, South Carolina's paper, about the curious parallel in an ethics investigation going on over the past couple of years down there, involving not only private email accounts, but coordination between the Attorney General and the very targets of the probe in order to, let's say try and shut down the investigation and dismiss the special prosecutor assigned to the case. Sound familiar? If you're not familiar with the case down in South Carolina, I can't blame you, but if maybe sounds familiar to you on a national level. So where were we with this one? We had just revealed that Wilson, our Attorney General, had confirmed on Friday that 3 former members of his staff, including his then Deputy Chief of Staff, Adam Piper, were all receiving paychecks from Richard Quinn and Associates, while also drawing state salaries. And Richard Quinn and Associates, of course, being a target of the probe. That does seem like it might be inappropriate. Wilson said those checks, typically for $300 to $500 a month, why would you even be getting them? It's a good question. Well, he says they were directly related to work Piper and the others did on their own time for his campaign, handling tasks such as filing, trips to the bank, and trips for political purposes. He said the money came from his campaign, but the checks were processed by RQA, Richard Quinn and Associates, because they handled his bookkeeping and campaign scheduling. That is, that's a very interesting excuse. I mean, it's almost plausible, but it does raise some interesting questions. I am curious. I don't know that I've seen maybe it's different in state politics, maybe just the state, maybe the state's statutes make it more feasible, but in which case they should probably revise them. But I don't know if I've ever run into a situation where political consultants also, you're like campaign consultants, pundit types that tell you what your messaging should be, also handling your bookkeeping, campaign scheduling, I guess, yes, but bookkeeping such that you're paying. I mean, look at how terrible this ends up looking. Members of the Attorney General's staff are being paid by the targets of an investigation, but only because they were on their own time running to the bank for their boss's campaign, and the campaign was really paying them, but the people got checks from the consultancy because the consultancy was handling the bookkeeping. Even so, I mean, does that even work out? I guess it's possible that in certain situations, hopefully where they don't involve politicians and law enforcement officials. But if you are working for a company and the company has a bookkeeping service, I mean, sometimes when it's a payroll company, you get paid and your paycheck says Paychecks on it or ADP on it or whatever. But I mean, does it not identify anywhere really who's actually paying you? I'm trying to think if I've ever gotten a check that way. I've been paid certainly by companies that use payroll services, and I'm definitely aware of that being the case, but I can't recall that the check never identified who was ostensibly paying me, such that it would end up looking like I was really being paid by the bookkeeping service as opposed to whoever I was working for. But I guess it's possible. But boy, is that fishy. And man, honestly, if you're doing that as a consultancy in the political sphere, do you really never take the time to make sure that that all the wires are uncrossed this way so that it's perfectly clear who's doing the payment for what? Well, I'm sure it actually happens in the political realm a lot because they're actually interested in that kind of obfuscation. And very often they do want to make it look like the consultant is the one that's paying you so that you do end up accidentally believing that so that you do them some favors in office. What a mess. It's pretty stupid to get yourself caught up in it quite that way. And it might very likely just be an excuse after the fact as well. I don't know. Wilson, however, firmly maintained that his dealings with the Quinns have always been above board, the article says. He said he never shared confidential information about the investigation with them or attempted to derail the probe in any way. He said he's always tried to, quote, do the right thing and conduct myself in an honorable fashion, as do his staffers. But they couldn't be bothered to identify where checks really came from, I guess. We respect the process and we don't want to do anything to inhibit or impede the cause of justice, he said. That's nice of you to acknowledge as the Attorney General. Wilson named Pasco special prosecutor for this whole thing in 2014. At the time, the investigation had ground to a halt after Harrell and his legal team accused Wilson of pursuing the case to satisfy political motives, a charge the Attorney General denied. Still, he tapped Pasco, a Democratic solicitor whose district includes Orangeburg and Dorchester counties, in an effort to get the investigation back on track. It worked, and Harrell pleaded guilty on October 23, 2014, to using campaign funds for personal use. He resigned his office. Harrell's plea agreement required him to cooperate with Pasco and other authorities on further public corruption investigations. Front and center were the remaining allegations contained in the SLED report, including those concerning Rick Quinn. The emails show Wilson reached out to Richard Quinn on October 26, 2014, and asked him to review 2 drafts of a letter he planned to send to Pasco the next day. In the drafts, Wilson thanked Pasco for his work on the Harrell case, while expressing concern about the plea agreement and Pasco's continued involvement in the investigation. Why? Wilson stated that Pasco's role was limited solely to the Harrell prosecution. He stated that he always intended to include Pasco as a collaborative partner on future cases, but made it clear that the Attorney General's office would be in control of the investigation and any prosecutions that arose from Harrell's cooperation. It's unclear what specific changes Quinn made or suggested to the drafts, but the final letter that emerged incorporated elements of both missives. The final letter, however, was signed by Wilson's Chief Deputy, John McIntosh, rather than the Attorney General himself. But he said it didn't even go out. What happened to that? Wilson said he ultimately decided to phone Pasco, here we are, instead, to ensure there were no questions about his tone. He said the two had a pleasant conversation and parted amicably. Wilson detailed that conversation in another letter that was sent to the solicitor and SLED Chief Mark Keel. The letter made it clear that Wilson's office would handle the probe from there on. Wilson said Friday he was referring new allegations that arose from Harrell's debriefings, not anything mentioned in the SLED report. That work would be handled by others in his office while he remained hands-off, he said. Weeks before the Harrell plea, Wilson had quietly assigned his chief deputy, McIntosh, to handle that task and serve as supervising prosecutor. He did so after Pasco emailed him on October 1st, 2014, urging that the lawmakers included in the sealed portion of the SLED report be prosecuted as part of the probe, according to court documents. Wilson forwarded Pasco's email to McIntosh. Wilson also noted that there might be inherent conflicts between myself and members of the House, and he asked his deputy to firewall him from any involvement in that specific instance as the probe moved forward, court documents show. He did not provide specifics in the email about the potential conflict he was referring to. After Pasco was warned off the case in October 2014, the corruption probe ground to a halt, and SLED investigators received no direction from Wilson's office for months on how to proceed with the remaining allegations included in the agency's report, according to an affidavit submitted by Keeld. In fact, the Attorney General's office had focused solely on Harrell since the SLED report was completed in late 2013 and had taken no action against any of the other legislators mentioned in the document since that time, he stated. The post-Harrell probe sat idle until July 2015, when McIntosh sent a letter to SLED's Keel indicating that the chief should seek a prosecutive decision, quote unquote, prosecutive decision from Pasco when SLED completed its review of the allegations contained in the redacted portions of its report. The letter noted Wilson had recused this office from the allegations against lawmakers mentioned in that section of the report, which included the misconduct accusations against Rick Quinn. Keel took this to mean that the entire Attorney General's office had stepped aside from the matter and that his investigators should again work with Pasco on the probe, the SLED chief said in an affidavit. Another of Wilson's top aides, forwarded McIntosh's letter to Pasco about a week later, along with the instructions, so I guess it did go out after all, along with the instructions that the solicitor and SLED were to make a determination on the allegations against the lawmakers in question and whether the full SLED report should be released to the public. It's unclear what prompted the sudden call to action, but media outlets, including the Post and Courier, were making inquiries about that time about the status of the investigation and why the redacted portion of the SLED report was still sealed if no further indictments were coming. Wilson said he was not privy to those discussions, but he assumed McIntosh made the move out of an abundance of caution upon realizing more work needed to be done. The moves, however, would set off a chain of events that would create a deep fissure between Pasco and Wilson and a renewed fight for control of the corruption probe. When Pasco attempted to use the state grand jury to help investigate the allegations against Quinn and others, Wilson fought back hard and again accused his special prosecutor of overstepping his authority. A year after telling Pasco his skills as a prosecutor were well known and respected, Wilson held an angry news conference denouncing the solicitor as tainted and not even his fifth choice for the job. This does sound a bit familiar. Their battle wound up before the state Supreme Court, which sided with Pasco and allowed him to retain control of the probe. Since that time, indictments have been handed down against Rick Quinn, Representative Jim Merrill, a Republican of Charleston, who's facing 30 ethics charges, and Senator John Courson, also a Republican from Columbia, accused of laundering campaign cash. Campaign cash for personal use through Richard Quinn and Associates. All three have been suspended from office. You don't get that at the federal level. They don't suspend them from office the way they do at state. What's more, the Post and Courier recently revealed that the FBI has joined in the expanding probe. Wilson said he now regrets his angry rant at last year's news conference, saying he got carried away sticking up for the honor of his office and the attorneys who work hard on his and the state's behalf. He said he now realizes he should have conveyed his arguments through court filings. I regret the press conference because I think I could have handled that better, he said, and it really overshadowed the good work his office was doing. It sure did, and for a guy who went out of his way, allegedly, to try to make sure that there were no mistakes about tone, it seems like an awfully amateurish mistake to make. In fact, it seems like it might not have been very much of a mistake at all. But then That's the point of the article. It just took me about an hour to get around to it. Very interesting, and I'm glad we were able to keep up on that one. Not often a subject of our reporting. Let's see. Here's some more fun feedback. Rebecca Roman says about our breaks, if this is an experiment, please end it now. I would love to. It's the experimenting is how will we get this down professionally. It's not an experiment that will go away, I don't think. Unless, of course, I guess the option is there for us to just say, let's abandon all interest in broadcasting on terrestrial radio and simply do podcast only and streaming on Netroots Radio Live, which is, it's basically what we're doing. We're only on a station or two out there in all of the country at the moment, and we certainly could have been doing a lot more to try to promote the use of the show on radio stations around the country. But of course, that'll probably end up being a full-time job all by itself, and an uncompensated one at that, as it's also rather difficult to negotiate payment from radio stations like this, and at the moment we don't require that. Because we're just getting started with it. So maybe it's something, it may end up being that the whole experiment with terrestrial radio is the part that goes out the window. And then some of the things that we like to say about Donald Trump or wish we could would make the air, and we wouldn't have to worry about any of our guests straying from the radio safety policy with respect to language. There's still a few words that I would probably censor myself from using, whether we were on broadcast radio or not. Well, I don't know. We'll have to give some consideration to all of that as we progress. And as we get more professional and more used to handling breaks like that. Is it just that you don't like us to leave you for 3 minutes, Rebecca? That's a possibility. That's something I thought might be somewhat disturbing to our Netroots Radio listeners. I could see that becoming uncomfortable. Hey, I'm bored here. There's some nice music. I'm hearing that. There's some good public service announcements. I love public service. You love public service. But it might take some getting used to. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting article that Greg has sent me. After he's run off and left us. True, but it doesn't mean that he has stopped having input with the show. Something from Brookings, which means, let's see. Typically takes about 3 hours to read through something like this, but we'll see. This one looks nice and short. And on point, certainly. Let's see. What have we got here? Elaine Kamarck, Kamarck. Apologies if I've mangled the name. Reconciliation, it says here in the title, reconciliation isn't the only rule to watch in Congress. Well, no, that's true. They have many rules. Let's find out what other rules in particular we ought to be watching in this not that long piece. On a sultry hot day, it's a flowery piece at that. On a sultry hot day in the middle of summer, a standing room only crowd gathered here in Washington to hear Molly E. Reynolds discuss her new book, Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. Interesting. The topic of the book, Senate procedures adopted to reduce the hurdles a bill must pass before it becomes law, has always been of interest to political scientists and historians of Congress. True. But in these days of tribal politics, previously obscure procedural issues have taken on new importance, especially the budget procedure known as reconciliation, and Reynolds' book explains why. Interesting. I think we could probably guess, but just because we've been over the subject for so long. And let's see if the article expresses everything that we think needs to be noted about that. The reconciliation process was created in 1974 as a part of the overall budget reforms enacted that year, the Budget Act. The reconciliation bill can be triggered by a budget resolution that contains instructions to specific congressional committees that tell them to develop proposals to change certain types of programs they oversee. That is a good basic explanation. Of course, we did learn this time around that it doesn't really matter whether the committees so instructed actually respond to those instructions, but that's the mystery for, another day. We'll be working on that one for a long time to come, I think. Unlike most other legislation, reconciliation bills cannot be filibustered. for the budgetary policy priorities that are eligible to be handled through the reconciliation process, this leaves the majority party with a decision about the best way to get what they want. Reynolds sums it up as follows. If the majority party is better off with the policy that reconciliation can produce, we would expect the majority leader to initiate the process. The leader's expectations about the different policies that can be achieved, however, are shaped by the preferences of the other actors who are powerful in each instance. In today's tumultuous congressional politics, the decision to use reconciliation is basically an indication that the party in charge wants to go it alone, in part because they know it is unlikely that a filibuster can be overcome on a key piece of legislation. This is what happened in the Senate's consideration of their 7-year-old campaign pledge to repeal Obamacare. Senate Republicans chose to use reconciliation, betting that they would get no Democratic votes and that they could hold on to nearly everyone in their caucus, and that if needed, Vice President Pence could break a tie in their favor. In other words, they bet they would lose only 2 votes, not 3. But in the end, they lost 3 votes, with Senator John McCain making a dramatic comeback from his hospital bed, and the measure died. All right, well, there's some inaccuracy in that. You know what it is, and the author likely knows what those inaccuracies are too, but was just using a shorthand to get through the paragraph more quickly and letting us discuss the piece in under 3 hours. But yes, what we're getting at here, it's interesting. I'm sure there's some discussion of it at some point in the article, but as the Congress grew more partisan and more tribal, the nature of reconciliation changed. And this has roots older, of course, than the Obamacare repeal. And they, Republicans in the Congress now will no doubt blame the use of reconciliation, the choice to use reconciliation to do the job, not on partisan politics, but rather on the Democratic Party's resort to reconciliation, as they like to tell it, to pass Obamacare in the first place. Of course, we have learned, and we knew at the time, no, they didn't pass Obamacare using reconciliation. They passed Obamacare through regular order, but they also didn't get any Republican votes at that time for partisan reasons. But the use of reconciliation at the time was for a very narrow class of adjustments that they wanted to make, that they thought presented a particular problem, but still fit within the Byrd rule and the other restrictions for the use of reconciliation. A very, very narrow portion of the fixes passed that way. Once it became clear that there would be no Republican cooperation whatsoever, even though Democrats held 59 votes in that Senate, they still wouldn't be able to get what they wanted out of the Senate, because Republicans were going to refuse to work with Democrats even on anything that made good sense, just so that Democrats weren't able to say, we've accomplished something that makes good sense. But the roots go back even further than that, of course, from the times in 2001 and 2003 that Republicans in the bare majority used reconciliation to pass the tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, in those years, including one that they only managed 50 votes for and had to use Vice President Cheney's vote to break the tie there. All right. Well, we know it goes back further than that. We'll continue with this article and distill out of it what they've got for us and our procedure buffs here on the Kagro in the Morning Show. After this next break, our last of the day, Rebecca, don't worry too much. We can find something to do with your 3 minutes, I am sure. You could tweet angrily about the president, certainly. And we'll be back after this last station break, made as an accommodation to our terrestrial radio partners, in about 3 minutes. And in the meantime, enjoy this musical interlude and public service announcement, if you will. I wish I could hear them. I'll have to find out if there's any way for me to engineer that up. Hang on and we'll be right back. Well, it looks like we're back here, and things run about 2 to 3 seconds behind, I think, although now, I got my questions about how this is going to work. So I tried to keep a close eye on the clock here. And, we'll see how this last one came out. We'll talk about it off the air. No reason to drag it on, but boy, it's difficult to, change what you're used to, isn't it? Well, at any rate, let's get back to the reconciliation consideration here from Brookings. We, left off with the, almost entirely accurate description. I don't blame our author here for using shorthand about how the zombie treason care bill was put into suspended animation. It says the measure died, but the measure hasn't died per se. Though it may never make a comeback, it's eligible to do so. What's next? That's the next question. As Reynolds teaches us, watch the procedural choices. Okay. As Congress turns to tax reform, Majority Leader McConnell has signaled that he will use reconciliation again. This means he expects to be able to muster 50 votes for a Republican-only bill, a conclusion reinforced by a letter from 45 Democratic senators who said they would only cooperate with Republicans if the tax plan did not add to the deficit or cut the annual tax bill of the richest 1% of taxpayers. Given the drama around the failure to repeal Obamacare, reconciliation is getting a lot of airtime, but Reynolds' book discusses other exceptions to the rule that are central to the current political drama in Washington. Congress has also been known to pass legislation that gives it a say in how a president is implementing the law in order to, as Reynolds writes, increase Congress's ability to oversee the actions of the executive. This week, Congress sent a bill to the president increasing the already stern sanctions on Russia. In it, they included a provision that would allow congressional review of the president's attempt to ease sanctions, including some special procedures smoothing the path of a legislative response to the president's decision. The White House objected to this provision in a signing statement, calling it unconstitutional, an unconstitutional restriction of the president's powers to negotiate with foreign powers. But the bill passed both houses of Congress by overwhelming numbers, making it unwise for the president to veto, as Congress had more than enough votes to override, and so he signed the bill. Interesting. We're close enough to the conclusion here that I'll just finish and then double back for some observations. This humiliation was overshadowed by the healthcare drama, but it is perhaps more significant for President Trump in the long run. The promise to repeal Obamacare started in 2010 and predated Trump's presidential campaign. While failure to repeal is probably more of a Republican congressional failure than a Trump failure, Russia is 100% a Trump problem. By including restrictions on the president's actions in the sanctions bill, both Democrats and Republicans have indicated that when it comes to Russia, they do not trust the president, and that could have ramifications as the many investigations of his campaign unfold. Now, let me go back here to the paragraph about the inclusion of this particular provision in the sanctions bill. This week, Congress sent this bill increasing the already stern sanctions and included in it provisions that would allow congressional review of the president's attempt to ease sanctions, including some special procedures smoothing the path of a legislative response to the president's decision. That is, shall we say, remarkably reminiscent really what they've been spending the bulk of their time doing in this Congress. I guess it shouldn't surprise us that they were able to engineer something like that based on, I guess, the Congressional Review Act, which was responsible for the bulk of the legislating done this year under this new Congress. The Congressional Review Act, of course, that traces its roots also back to the so-called Republican Revolution following the 1994 elections that swept Newt Gingrich into power. Newt Gingrich, of course, will not shut up even all these years later, and his own disastrous public relations fiascos of various kinds. But anyway, that was something that they passed. I think it eventually made its way into the contract with America. But just basically, you've probably heard. We certainly described it because they used it so often during the beginning, at least, of this new term of Congress. It's the one that gives you 60 days, I think, is the original time frame 60 days to review any executive actions and rulemakings of the executive branch in Congress, and to, without being subject to the filibuster in the Senate, roll back or repeal those regulations. But the Congressional Review Act and the Budget Act, both being two instances, I guess, that draw, that gets us to the title of this book, that there are more places than just reconciliation that include procedural protections from the filibuster, and the Congressional Review Act is one of them. Had it not had that protection, and I mean, it was obvious that they needed it. It was drawn up in the heat of another fight over the use of the filibuster, another constitutional hardball period during which Republicans had taken back the majority in the House for the first time in 40 years. And in anticipation of that, they wrote it into their contract with America that they would protect these rollback attempts from filibuster, because they had very recently seen Democrats use it to some advantage, but of course nothing close to the volume and egregiousness with which it was used by Republicans in later years, including not that many years later, in the 2005 now that was I'm thinking again of Democrats and their use of it, but there were two peak periods from both parties when they were in the minority as things escalated. But from about 95 on, there were two Democratic periods of minority in the Senate during which the use of the filibuster increased, and they were matched very shortly thereafter during periods of Democratic majority and Republican minority in the Senate by an escalation in the use, both in the numbers and the egregiousness of the use of the filibuster by Republicans returned to the minority. But anyway, so they knew that was going to happen, which is why they built it into the Congressional Review Act. And increasingly, that's a popular idea. Well, typically whenever Republicans are designing something that they intend to use later on. The Congressional Review Act lay dormant for an awful long time before it was really usable by the Republicans in Congress. But they did make the most of it during the first couple months of the Trump administration. It was really all that they could agree on and all that they could do, and all that they were able to get through with a narrow majority. But it is kind of interesting. The whole article is sort of interesting in pointing out that, the partisanship and tribalism has changed the nature of the use of reconciliation. I think the original design, when you're talking about back in 1974, it's not that there wasn't partisanship, obviously, and there was certainly plenty of tribalism post-Watergate, but it was definitely still a different atmosphere in the Senate, in Congress in general. There was certainly a lot more work across partisan lines. There was a sizable liberal Republican contingent, and there was a lot more cooperation across the aisle on things like this. But good government type reforms that had bipartisan participation still very often found themselves subject to being stymied by the filibuster. And the Budget Act wrote protection for reconciliation in there, mostly because they realized that reconciliation would be, originally was supposed to be a tool that the Senate could call upon. Both the houses, of course, would make use of it. But the protections for the bill in the Senate was designed to protect tough, usually still bipartisan decision-making about cutting the budget, putting the squeeze on constituents of somebody, somewhere, which they at the time considered a necessity for budgetary reasons, but that they knew would be unpopular. And it's the sort of thing that even if you could eventually break the filibuster and impose cloture, invoke cloture on the bill. And also remember, I guess in 1974, when they passed the thing, they were still talking about a 2/3 majority necessary for cloture. There's 67 vote cloture. Back then they hadn't yet reformed it and ratcheted it down to 60. So it was much easier to block things, but the filibuster wasn't as frequently used in those days, certainly not as frequently used as it is now, although, you get the sense from watching the history of filibuster reform, the fact that they, in 1975 revised it down from 2/3 to 3/5 tells you that they were certainly experiencing what they felt was an inappropriate increase in the use of the political or partisan filibuster, but it wasn't quite as partisan and tribal. Even then, it was simply a matter of liberal, reformer, good government types versus old line, more conservative congressional bulls, as they called them in the old days. And that even what we, I guess, in the past, maybe even still today, although it might be labeled a neoliberal for saying things like this. But, think old school here. Don't necessarily have to accept these practices under our modern consideration of things like modern monetary theory or progressivism in general. But back in the day, there was a Washington consensus, true neoliberal in nature, I guess, that restraining the budget was something that was overall fiscally wise for whatever reason. And we can question the wisdom of the decision, but the consensus existed. But it was, of course, subject to, all sorts of constraints, including the conservative old bulls who either just simply, some of whom were old line, old left, congressional old bulls who favored heavy social spending and from a perspective that would be favorable to our current interpretation, and we'd like to see again, perhaps, and sometimes conservative or sometimes conservative Southern Democrat old bulls as well, weighing in on these things, that people who either didn't like the social spending or for whatever reason had a territory, a turf that they wanted to protect. And sometimes it was simply looking out for constituents. If you targeted a program for a cut that only operated in a certain corner of the country, such things were vulnerable to political attack. But the filibuster or the threat of filibuster could often save them from attack. And the design of the Budget Act, as I understand it, was to try to get around that somewhat. I mean, even though Byrd, who was responsible for a great deal of it, was himself he's an odd mix, I guess, but I guess you could call him a conservative-ish old bull, certainly. Although like I said, he was an odd mix coming from West Virginia. It's a little bit of a contradictory thing. But I think he was designing this process to try to make it possible to get tough spending decisions made if you could get a consensus around it from a majority. They just wanted to make it more difficult, really impossible, for any one senator to put the brakes on anything that didn't have a broad level of support across party lines and across regions in the Senate, and maybe attack the margins of what they considered overspending that way. They didn't want it to be the continuing prerogative of individual senators to be able to protect entire billion-dollar programs against the will of the majority of the Senate. It only later I guess you could certainly argue that it wasn't until 2001 when they used it for the tax cuts, standing the original intent, though it wasn't the intent of the founders, it was the intent of the founders of the budget and reconciliation process, turning the intent of the reconciliation process on its head by using it to increase the deficit by cutting taxes. But I don't think it was until that point that anybody began to regard reconciliation as a process to be used when you had a narrow majority because your majority was narrow. In other words, other times they said, well, I think we can put together a loose coalition across party lines of a majority of the Senate to overrule, for instance, the old bulls that tended to run the committees and could stymie the process or could threaten a filibuster because of a pet project or something like that. And it wasn't until that many years later, in 2001, that people said, you know what, the coalition can be built entirely in one party. And we can try to squeeze things in under the rules and make use of the protection from the filibuster, not because hard but sensible choices were being made, but that because choices that an entire party would oppose were being made. That's, I think, a very big difference in the way reconciliation got used. And I would imagine that that's a theme that would emerge in the book, but it's a little bit more difficult to explain in a brief piece like that. Anyway, plenty more things that we could turn our attention to, and why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's see. I was poking around in Pocket before trying to decide what would be the most interesting use of our time on these things, and I think I landed on, well, you know what? Here, why don't we make use of this one? This is the one that Brian Monroe shared the other day and that I hinted at probably on Friday. An interesting political development, not necessarily an up-to-the-minute thing, but an interesting thing that we all ought to be watching nonetheless. From out of Canada, because he's Canadian himself, he sends us the CBC report. The Keystone XL pipeline survived politics in the sense that they got Donald Trump elected and he was able to at least express his interest in overturning the previous holds on construction. Survived politics, but economics could kill it. And we did hear this news just the other day. This more full description of what happened here. TransCanada has invited customers to bid for long-term contracts to ship oil on the pipeline. The Associated Press running this piece in the CBC from August 3rd. The proposed Keystone XL pipeline survived 9 years of protests, lawsuits, and political wrangling that saw the Obama administration reject it and President Donald Trump revive it, but now the project faces the possibility of death by economics. I pointed this out the other day, and I think I might have seen, it might even have been Bill McKibben tweeting about this story, and I thought, what an important reason to bring it up, just in terms of if you ever thought that you were banging your head against a brick wall, that there was no point in getting out there and protesting or even fighting politically over something that seemed like, at long last, an inevitability. This should be a lesson for you. I mean, everything finally in the end fell into place for Keystone XL. Politically speaking, they won the political fight. If you think, cheating and colluding with Russia counts as winning the political fight. But in the end, the fight had gone on for so long that economic conditions changed along the way, such that when the path was finally cleared politically, it wasn't even clear to TransCanada that it was any longer anything worth pursuing economically. In other words, they fought so long that the underlying assumptions changed and may actually eventually prevent the construction and completion of the pipeline anyway. In other words, you win. You lose the political fight, but win anyway because circumstances change. That has no guarantee to it. It doesn't mean that the conditions are always going to change, but the ground's always shifting. And another important point about the choice to fight. Say there's nothing we can do about this, but can we slow it down enough so that maybe a miracle occurs in the meantime? Always take that opportunity. And it's important. It comes up in Senate procedure a lot. Like, why spend so much time dragging out a process for the nominations, executive and judicial nominations, when they are in fact inevitable because of the filibuster reform? And the answer is you never know what could change along the way. I'll continue on with the article, though, so that you have some real facts to work with. They survived, the Keystone XL pipeline survived 9 years of protests, lawsuits, and political wrangling, but now the project faces possibility of death by economics. Low oil prices, that's what changed, and high costs of extracting Canadian crude from oil sands are casting new doubts on Keystone XL as executives with the Canadian company that wants to build it face the final regulatory hurdle next week in Nebraska. I guess that would be this week. The pipeline proposed in 2008, I hope that hasn't changed since the time I began reading the article, has faced dozens of state and federal delays, many of them prompted by environmental groups who ultimately persuaded then-President Barack Obama to deny federal approval in November of 2015. President Donald Trump resuscitated the project in March, declaring that Calgary-based TransCanada would create an incredible pipeline. So incredible, I tell you. After all that, a TransCanada executive raised eyebrows in the energy industry last week when he suggested that the pipeline developer doesn't know whether it will move forward with the project. Paul Miller, an executive vice president who is overseeing the project, told an investor call that company officials won't decide until late November or early December whether to start construction. We'll make an assessment of the commercial support and the regulatory approvals at that time, Miller said in the conference call Friday with investors. The company has invited customers to bid for long-term contracts to ship oil on the pipeline. The bidding will run through September. An energy expert said the project has been delayed so long it may no longer make economic sense. Frankly, the current price climate, it's probably not going to be a going venture unless there's a massive improvement in technology for processing Canadian crude, said Charles Mason, a University of Wyoming professor of petroleum and gas economics. Crude oil was trading at around $49.50 U.S. dollars anyway, a barrel on Wednesday, down from highs of more than $100 in U.S. dollars in 2014. The 1,900-kilometer pipeline would transport oil from oil sands deposits in Alberta, Canada, across Montana and South Dakota to Nebraska, where it would connect to existing pipelines that feed Texas Gulf Coast refineries. South Dakota and Montana regulators have approved the project, although there are legal challenges pending in both states. Only Nebraska has yet to give regulatory approval. The rest of the route for the oil and to the Gulf would travel through existing pipelines in the network. Mason said the biggest economic problem is that synthetic crude from the Canadian deposits is considered a lower value product because it tends to be heavier and thus more expensive to refine into gasoline and jet fuel. It's also more expensive to extract than other oils. Producers have also found other ways to ship oil, primarily by train, which also doesn't make us very happy, but okay. And many are reluctant to sign long-term contracts with a pipeline that wouldn't go into operation for several more years, said Jeff Scher, editor of the Houston-based Pipeline and Gas Journal, a leading industry publication. Given the difficulties, Scher said TransCanada has probably a 50-50 chance of completing the project. The 5-member Nebraska Public Service Commission is supposed to decide by November 23rd whether the project serves the public's interests based on evidence presented by attorneys in a formal legal proceeding beginning Monday and a series of public hearings held over the last few months. The elected commission is comprised of 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. How fair can you get, right? Well, it's elected. Environmental opposition to the project has persisted in Nebraska, where opponents say the pipeline would pass through the Sandhills, an ecologically fragile region of grass-covered sand dunes, and would cross the land of farmers and ranchers who don't want it. Nebraska law enforcement authorities already have had discussions with their counterparts in North Dakota about how that state, North Dakota, handled widespread protests during construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline near the Standing Rock, Indiana reservation. It says Indiana, but it's an Indian reservation, not Indiana, I guess, said Cody Thomas, a Nebraska State Patrol spokesman. Protesters led by Native American tribes, of course, and environmental groups flocked to North Dakota last summer to rally against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and some camped out in bitter cold through early this year, prompting the state to send a large law enforcement contingent and borrow law enforcement contingents from other states, by the way, that sometimes skirmished with protesters. The pipeline was ultimately completed, but legal challenges remain. The pipeline opponents in Nebraska said they're wary of TransCanada's recent statements and don't believe the company will surrender without a fight. It's probably wise, I would say. We can't let our guard down. said Jim Carlson, a farmer near Silver Creek, Nebraska, who grows corn on the pipeline's proposed route. We've got to continue to be vigilant and proactive. TransCanada could be doing things just to throw us off. Certainly true. Carlson said TransCanada has offered him $307,000 since the company first contacted him in 2013, but he refuses to sign an easement agreement to grant access to his land. To highlight his opposition, Carlson is installing solar panels on his land directly in the path of the proposed pipeline. If the Nebraska Commission approves the route, TransCanada can initiate legal proceedings under eminent domain to gain access to the land of holdout property owners. TransCanada has secured agreement with roughly 90% of Nebraska landowners along the route. The company said that if it decides to go ahead with the project, it would need 6 to 9 months to start doing some of the staging of the construction crews, followed by 2 years of construction. So it's not dead. It's certainly in zombie state at this point, just like the health care bill, which we'll check in more about later in the week. But I think an amazing and important lesson in the value of activism, even in the face of long or even impossible to overcome odds. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose per se, is not, at least in the political sphere, is not the final word always on whether things will come together. Underlying economic conditions can change the longer you drag these things out. It works either way. It can work for Republicans and conservatives just the same, so there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Of course, it does add to their rallying cry. It becomes their rallying cry that bureaucratic delays and red tape and protests are what lead to these things falling apart, whereas the reality is that it's the free market in the end that makes the thing fall apart. An observation I think they would, of course, be reluctant to acknowledge, but what else is new? Anyway, time for us to play ourselves out of the day's operations and close the books on day one of our little experiment with our station breaks. I'm pleased to being able to have participated in a dispersed operation over distance that could actually get those things sounding relatively professional. Thanks again to Justice for helping to engineer those things. Apologies to those of you who didn't know what to do with yourselves during our 3-minute breaks. I know it can be tough, and it gets in the way of things. But look, that's radio. And eventually we should be able to become used to this idea, and maybe we can even help use it to monetize the show and take the onus of supporting it off of all of you who have to date been so generous with your donations via Patreon, PayPal, and so many other channels, Square Cash as well. Thank you to each and every one of you who continues to contribute to help us stay on the air and pay for the equipment that makes this stuff run even when we have to take a break from time to time. What's coming up on the after show next right here on Netroots Radio, where you should be streaming all day live? Well, let's scroll down so I can grab it for you. The alt-right's assault on McMaster is Bannon's revenge for the firings of his protégés. Twitter suspends an army of fake pro-Trump accounts after Trump thanks a propaganda bot for supporting him. Oh, big story over the weekend, and much, much more next.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Much more, as I said. They'll be reporting that more than 75 consumer groups fight the Trump administration's efforts to stop lawsuits by abused nursing home residents. That sounds rather rotten. And a U.S. citizen held by ICE for 3 years, then dumped in Alabama with no money and no explanation, is denied compensation by the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals.